Alright, hey, welcome to the Coding Zoo. If this is your first time joining, my name is Shane. Today's lesson, we're going to cover the items listed right here. If you are not familiar with those items, hey, no worries, stick around. We're going to jump right in. Alright, hey, let's go ahead and get started. Before we do so, though, I just want to mention, if you like this video and in the end, go ahead and click that subscribe button below. That helps us a lot. Go ahead and tell others about the Coding Zoo and our goal to help others learn how to program. Let's go ahead and jump into today's lesson. And I'm going to open up this index.html file. Okay, so as you can see here on my screen, I have this basic HTML file. HTML basically stands for Hypertext Markup Language. What that means is that it basically is a way to describe data, to mark it up to where you're describing data. So HTML was invented to send data across the internet and to provide tags or elements that describes that data, that marks it up and explains what that data is. So if I look at this index.html page, I have some basic data on the screen. I've got a title here, another title, and a couple of sentences, right? If I go to the code for this, go to index.html, right click, choose edit with Notepad++. If you look at this code, you'll see that I have HTML and I have these tags, these elements around my data. For example, this H2 tag is around the lesson. We'll explain the difference in the two. So H2 is basically just an element that describes the data. It's not really, these tags aren't really meant to be for changing the look and feel, although some of the tags will do that with the browsers, but their main purpose is to actually explain what the data is. We should use HTML for just describing the data. If we go over to our style sheets, which is called CSS, Cascading Style Sheets. Cascading Style Sheets is what we should use to actually change the look and feel of our data. It's what marks the data up to look differently or be rearranged differently, or change the color, change the darkness. That's what cascading style sheets are for. Style sheets are for changing the look and feel. So HTML is for transferring the data and describing it. Style sheets is for changing the look and feel of the data once you've transferred it. And next you have JavaScript. Well, if I go back to this index page here, you'll see that I have some JavaScript at the very top with this function called change CSS. Well, JavaScript is a way to make your HTML document have behavior, to make it do something. So let's check this page out. Let's see all three of those things working together. So let me go back to the browser. Here's my simple HTML data here. I haven't styled it any except with the H1, H2 tags, right? So we have this simple bolding, and my text is just looks like regular text. So I created these three links down here at the bottom. There's one that says no style sheet. I'll click on that. And you see what we have here. We don't have any styling. We just have the plain HTML. It's just data. All right, I'm going to click on style sheet number 1. And boom, you'll see that all of the style, the look and feel changed. You actually have color, you have depth, you have boldness, things are separated. My two paragraphs here turned into radio buttons. Everything looks totally different. So I changed the look and feel. I did that by applying a style sheet to this document. Now, how did I make this link apply a style sheet to my document? Well, I did that through JavaScript. I used JavaScript to add behavior. So I added a link to my document, and that link has behavior. And that behavior is to change the style sheet that works with the HTML. If I go down to the bottom one here to style sheet 2 and click on it, boom, I changed the style again, right? I'm using JavaScript for behavior to make that link do something. And what it's doing is it's actually changing the style sheet behind the scenes. So when I say change the style sheet, If I go back to my notepad over here, you'll see that I have a style 1 CSS, and I have a style 2 CSS, and I have a style sheet that's basically none. There's no style tags in there. There's no CSS tags in there. So basically, I'm making the JavaScript switch between these 3 style sheets and apply it to this HTML data. That's how I'm getting the different looks and feel. So this is basically all 3 of those technologies working together. One to provide and describe the data, which is HTML. One to give it the style, layout and color, which is CSS, cascading style sheets, and the other is JavaScript, which gives it behavior. That's basically how the 3 technologies complement each other. That's how they work together. So one more time, let me go back to the browser. Okay, I'm going to click Style Sheet 1. It's going to launch behavior. That behavior is going to change the style sheet to Style Sheet 1. And now my look and feel has changed. Now you'll notice all of the data on the page is the same data. I'm just displaying it differently. Style Sheet 2 again. Looks totally different, right? Looks better. And back to no style sheet. And there's just my plain HTML. So hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions, let me know. Just drop me a message below. Let's jump into actually creating our environment. So I'm going to go here to my desktop. Okay, I'm going to right click, choose new and folder, and I'm going to call this Coding Zoo, or call it whatever you like. If you're doing the CSS lessons, maybe call it Coding Zoo CSS. If you're doing the JavaScript lessons, maybe call it Coding Zoo JavaScript. I'm going to call it Coding Zoo CSS. Okay, so I've created a folder. I'm going to go inside that folder. I'm going to right click, choose new, choose folder. I'm going to name it CSS. CSS. So this is where we're going to put our style sheets at. I'm going to right click, choose new, do folder. I'm going to name it JavaScript or JS. Let's use JS. One more time. Oh, that's it. Let's right click and choose new and choose text document. And let's create an index.html. So if your text document doesn't show an extension here, if you're in Windows, you want to go to View, and you want to make sure you have File Name, Show File Name Extensions checked so you can see the extensions. So I have a text document here. I'm going to rename it completely into index.html. Okay, choose yes. All right, so now I have a CSS folder, a JS folder, and a file called index.html. All right, so I'm going to edit. I'm going to right click on the index.html. You can choose to open with Notepad, or I'm going to use Notepad++. Okay, so now I'm in Notepad++, and I'm going to go ahead and create a HTML document. So type in HTML tag, so less than HTML greater than sign, press enter, put the ending tag, so less than / to the right, HTML greater than sign. So now I have 2 elements there. I'm going to go back underneath the HTML tag, tab out. I'm going to type in less than HEAD for head, and less than / HEAD to end that. And then I'm going to go down to the next row, and I'm going to type in less than and the body element. So BODY greater than, and then I'm going to close it off. So less than / BODY, and then greater than. So now I have a head section, a body section, and an HTML section. Okay, so next thing I'm going to do is go over and to the head, and in the head I am going to link. I'm going to put my cursor between the 2 tags and the head element, press enter. I'm going to add a line in between those 2 tags, and I'm going to add a link tag. So less than L-I-N-K space R-E-L equals quote, that's a double quote rather, the word style sheet, S-T-Y-L-E-S-H-E-E-T, end quote, in the double quote, space. And then type, T-Y-P-E, equals, double quote, the word text, T-E-X-T, / CSS, in the double quote, space, href, H-R-E-F, equals, double quote, CSS, / style, S-T-Y-L-E .CSS, in double quote, / so that's a slash leaning towards the right, and then greater than sign. Okay, so there we go. We have an HTML document. It has a head and a body, and it has a link to a style sheet. We haven't created that style sheet yet, but we'll do that next. Okay, so this is kind of a template, and what I recommend that you do is at each lesson, if you're doing CSS lesson 1, go ahead and make a copy of this template and do lesson 1 and call the folder lesson 1. If you're doing lesson 2, go ahead and copy the folder and call it lesson 2. And that way, as you learn each element or each feature, you'll have a copy of that lesson. So if you need to go back and look at it and see, hey, how did I do that feature? You'll have a folder that has just that feature. So let's go ahead and save. And now I'm going to go and create that file. It's called style.css. So I'm going to go back to my desktop, go into that Coding Zoo folder. Okay, double click on the CSS folder. I'm going to right click, choose new, text document, and then I'm going to rename it to style.css, STYLE.css. And there we go. So if you look at my folder here, I have a Coding Zoo CSS folder. It has a CSS folder inside of it. It has a JavaScript folder inside of it, or JS folder inside of it. And it has an index.html file. And if I go on my CSS, I'll see that I have a style.css inside of it. So that's my template. Make a copy of it, and then each time you start a video lesson, just make a copy of it and use that new copy for that lesson and rename your main folder. If it's called Coding Zoo CSS, rename it to Coding Zoo Lesson 1 or Coding Zoo CSS 1 or Coding Zoo CSS 2, something like that. And that way you'll always have a backup of each lesson. You can go back and see how you did that feature. So I'm going to go to my desktop here. I'm going to find that folder, and I'm going to right click and choose copy, and then I'm going to right click on my desktop and choose paste. You can also do Control C and Control V for that. And now I'm going to basically rename that folder to CZ-CSS 1. So I'm going to right click, choose rename, type in CZ-CSS 1. Okay, so now we have a copy of that folder. It's renamed to reflect that we're doing CSS lesson 1. And we're going to be doing quite a few lessons. So let's go ahead and create a new folder on our desktop. So I'm going to right click and choose new, choose folder. And now I'm going to right click on that new folder, choose rename. And I'm going to call it CSS or rather I'm going to call it CZ-CSS. So now I have a folder on my desktop called CZ-CSS. I'm going to take the CZ-CSS1 folder and I'm going to right click on it, choose copy. I'm going to double click on the CZ.CSS folder, double click on it. Now I'm going to right click in that folder and choose paste. And there we go. So now we have a main folder for our CSS lessons, and we have lesson 1 subfolder inside of it. So this is going to be a long lesson for lesson 1. We're usually going to try to keep it around 5 minutes, but because we're setting this up for the first time, it's going to take a little bit longer today. But in the future, it'll be just copy your template folder and rename it and get started. Okay, so let's go ahead and go inside of the CSS1 folder and right click on our index.html file. I use Notepad++. If you haven't installed it, I'll put a link in the description below on how to install it. You can also use Notepad, but I'm going to choose Edit with Notepad++. I now have my index.html file open, and in the first video, if you haven't gone through the first video in this series, we talked about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and we set up this template folder. You should have already gone through that. So I open up the index.html file. I've got my template there. I've got my HTML element, my head, my body, and I have a link to a style sheet. And that's what we're going to be working with. We're going to be working with that style sheet. Let's first start by adding, going to the body and adding the HTML element h1. So I'm going to go to the body, tag the first one, put my cursor on the right side, press enter. I'm going to tab out by pressing the tab button. I'm going to type in less than h1 greater than. I'm going to type my name, SHANE, and then I'm going to type in less than / h1 and type a greater than sign and save it. So now I'm going to click on the save icon. So I have my h1 element, and inside of that element I have my name. So I'm going to go back to my folder. I'm going to right click on it, choose open with Google Chrome or whatever browser you're using. And there we go. We have my browser open and I can see my name in big bold letters. So that's my h1 tag. Now let's say we didn't want that h1 tag to look that way. So h1 stands for heading. It's really about describing your data. h1, it's your heading, your main heading, your first heading. But let's say we wanted to change it and we don't want the default settings. So that's what CSS is all about. Let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go back to my Notepad++. And the first way you can do styles is you can go to the h1 tag, and this is called an inline style. I usually do this when I'm just trying something out. It's not something I would recommend to do in bigger projects long term. Usually you want to put all of your styles into the style sheet. That way they can be reused. And that'll be the last way I go over with you today on how to do styles. But this way is called inline styles. It's great if you want to try something out real quick. So I'm going to type in space, and I'm going to add attribute to my h1 element, style equals, double quote, I'm going to put color, COLOR, colon, RED, semicolon, in double quote. So I just added the style attribute. Now the style attribute is allowing me to put a CSS property on the h1 tag. So this is called an inline style. So this property has a property name, which is color. So all CSS properties are defined this way. You have a name, or property name, color. In this case, you have a colon, and then your value for that property. In my case, I put red, and then you end it with a semicolon. So that's very important. Each CSS property, that's the syntax for creating a property. Property name, colon, property value, end it with semicolon. So I'm going to click on the icon to save, go back to my browser, and I'm going to click refresh, and there we go. Now my style has changed on the H1 element on my heading. My heading is now red. So that's called inline style. Let's jump to the second way you can create styles. Go back to my document. I'm going to go ahead and delete that attribute that I added. And I'm going to go back to the top here. And in the top, I'm going to my head element. Let's go to the end of that link line. I'm going to press enter, add a line underneath there, and I'm going to add a section called style. So less than STYLE, greater than sign, press enter, less than forward slash, STYLE, greater than sign. I'm going to hit my up arrow key, press enter to go to the middle of that element, tab out, and now I'm going to add what's called an element selector. And we'll go in depth later on in one of the next videos on the different types of selectors. In this case, I'm going to add an element selector. I'm going to try to find all the H1 tags. So I'm going to say H1 space, the squiggly bracket, which is shift bracket, and I'm going to end that squiggly bracket, shift in closing bracket, go to the middle of the bracket, and I'm going to type in that same property, color, COLOR, colon, RED, semicolon. So this is a style block. It's in my heading. So instead of putting it in your H1 tag, you can put it in your heading, and then that CSS selector can be reused multiple times in your document without having to copy it more than once, right? You only have it one time versus having inline to several elements. Click save, go to my browser, and click refresh, and it should stay red. It did. Awesome. So that's working. It found the H1 tag and it colored it red. It's no longer black like it used to be in the first when we first opened up the document. So let's go over the third and final way of adding styles to your CSS page. Go ahead and go back to index.html. I'm going to take that whole style block and I'm going to use my left mouse button and highlight it. I'm going to right click, choose cut. And now I'm going to go to my folder. I go to my CSS subfolder. I'm going to right click on that style.css file we created in the first introduction video, and I'm going to choose edit with Notepad++ or Notepad. And now I have that style.css open. I'm going to right click, choose paste, and now I have the style pasted into that document. So since this is a style.css file, you don't actually have to put a style section. So let's remove the style element. So I'm going to get rid of the begin tag, get rid of the end tag, and I'm going to delete some spaces behind that H1 so that it's tabbed out correctly. In this case, it shouldn't be tabbed out. So now I have a file called style.css. I've got an H1 CSS element selector. It has the property defined for color, colon, red, semicolon. I'm going to change it to blue this time, BLUE. And now I'm going to click save. I'm going to go back to my index.html file. Now, because we linked that style sheet, this document, the browser is going to pull that property in. It's going to pull that style sheet in because it's linked to the index.html. So I've clicked saved. I'm going to go back to my folder. I'm going to right click on index.html and I'm going to choose open with Google Chrome. Boom. There we go. So now my H1 heading is colored blue and I have an CSS style sheet attached to my HTML page. So with the style section, you can reuse styles inside your document. With inline styles, you can't reuse them. You have to write them over and over and over again for each element that you want to style. Now what if you want to share styles across pages? And you usually do. And that's why it's the preferred method. Then you would use style sheets. So I can attach that style sheet to multiple HTML pages and reuse those styles across all my web pages. So that's the preferred method. That's the beauty of it. You can reuse. You don't want to have duplicate code. That's more to maintain later, and it can get pretty hairy. So you want to be sure to use that way of creating styles. Now, as we learn, there are definitely easier ways for you to practice these styles. There are programs on the web you can use where you just type it in. You don't have to create these files, all that good stuff. I'm purposely choosing for us to create these files so you understand how these files work together. If you want to learn using those editors on the web, feel free to do that, but I just wanted you to understand how to create these files and work with files. That's why we're going this route. In this lesson, we're going to cover the different type of CSS selectors. So CSS selectors are a way of applying CSS rules to an element. A selector is a way of searching for a particular element that you want to apply a rule to. I have my CZ-CSS1 folder from the first lesson. I'm going to go ahead and take that coding zoo CSS folder that we originally created, the template. I'm going to right click on it, choose copy. I'm going to go to this subfolder, to the folder CZ-CSS-lessons, and I'm going to press Control V to copy it there. And now I'm going to rename it to CZ-CSS2. So this will be our second lesson. So now I have a CZ-CSS2 lesson 2 folder, and that's what we're going to do each lesson. Go ahead and copy your template to create a new lesson folder. That way it leaves you a reference to the work you did in previous lessons, so you can go back and look at it in case you forget a particular feature. So I won't go over that anymore. We're going to keep doing that each. Be used to it by now. We're just going to go cut and paste and get started. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go into the CSS2 folder. I'm going to right click on index.html. I'm going to choose edit with Notepad++ or Notepad if you're using it. I'm going to go to my index.html page there, and I'm going to add an h1 tag. So less than h1 greater than, and I'm going to type in heading 1, heading 1, less than / a slash leaning towards the right, h1 greater than sign. I'm going to press enter. I'm doing this inside my body, of course. So I'm going to type in less than h2 and greater than, and I want to type in the word heading 2, heading 2. I'm going to add my ending HTML element. Type in less than. I'm going to type in h2 greater than sign. All right, so I have two different tags here. Press enter. I'm going to type in one more. So less than h3 greater than, type in the word heading 3, heading space 3. I'm going to put a closing tag, less than / h3 greater than sign. And on my h2 tag, on the end tag, I forgot to put the /. So found that bug real quick. Let's knock that bug out. So put a /. There we go. All right. Okay, I'm going to click save. Okay, now I'm going to go back to my CSS folder. I'm going to right click on the style.css, choose edit with Notepad++. It's now open in my Notepad++ also. Before we change the style on these h1 tags, let's go ahead and open up the web page. So I'm going to go back to my CZ-CSS2 folder, right click on the index.html file, choose open with, and choose your browser, in my case Google Chrome. There we go. All right, so now you should see I have the heading 1 tag, heading 2 tag, and heading 3 tag in use. Notice there's some default styling for h1. tags, you shouldn't get used to using that. The HTML element should be used for describing your data, not for styling your data. So use CSS for styling your data. So we actually may later on change the size of H1 to be a little bit bigger, maybe a little bit smaller. But anyway, let's go ahead and add some styling to these different tags here. So we're going to go over 3 different ways to do that. Let's go back to Notepad++. Let's go into our styles class, and the first way we're going to do is just like we did in lesson 2. Let's go type in H1 space squiggly line, squiggly bracket, close squiggly bracket, put my arrow in the middle, press enter, and now I'm going to add the property color, COLOR, colon, BLUE, semicolon. And I like to put a space between the property name and value. So I'm going to add a space there. Choose save. Go back to my browser, choose refresh. And there we go, it's blue. Okay, so this is called, this selector is setting the rule that color should be blue. And it's an element selector. It's trying to search for the H1 elements. So any H1 element in your document will now turn blue. So this is called an element selector. All right, now go back to your index.html file, go to your heading tag, and let's add in the H2 tag, the heading 2 tag, let's add an attribute. So let's go to your H2 element, let's type in another attribute, press space, we're going to type in the attribute class, so CLASS equals, double quote, and now I'm going to put in subtitle. SUBTITLE in double quote. I'm going to click save. So I just set an attribute on my HTML element, and I set it to the value of subtitle. The attribute I set was class, and I set it to the value of subtitle. Now I can do this on all HTML elements. All HTML elements support the class attribute. So if I want to, I can also put the same class on H3. I'm not going to do that, but I'm just saying that you can do that. All right, and that's the beauty of having a CSS class. You can reuse it on HTML elements by using the class attribute. Okay, so I'm pointing to a subtitle CSS class, but we haven't created that yet. So I'm going to go back to my styles and CSS, go beneath my H1 tag, press enter, and I'm going to type in dot SUBTITLE space squiggly open bracket squiggly close bracket, put my cursor in the middle, press enter, and I'm going to type in color, COLOR, colon, RED, and then semicolon. So my H1 section up here above is a element selector. I just created a class selector. So I've defined a class on the H2 tag called subtitle. This is a selector. It's basically a search mechanism to say, hey, find all the classes that are called subtitle. Color them red. So I'm going to click save, go to my browser, click refresh, and there we go. Now my heading tags are red. Now I can take that same class attribute and class equals subtitle and put it on other elements, and those elements will turn red. So you can reuse that class. All right, so that's creating a class and selecting that class, searching for it, and applying a CSS property to it. So there's one other way we're going to go over today on how to search for HTML elements to apply CSS properties to. Let's go back to our Notepad++. All right, so I'm going to go to my index.html, go to H3 tag, and let's give it an ID. I'm going to say ID equals double quote, and I'm going to put section, SECTION dash title, TITLE. Okay, so I have H3 ID, which is an attribute, equals section title. So my value of the ID attribute on my H3 tag is called section title. So I'm going to go back to my styles.css, and now I'm going to choose to search for all HTML elements that have an ID of section-title. So I'm going to put a pound sign, which is your shift 3. So pound, SECTION-TITLE, space, open squiggly bracket, close squiggly bracket. Put my cursor in the middle, press enter, go to the next line, type in color, COLOR, colon, and let's do orange, ORANGE, semicolon, and I am choosing some weird colors today, but okay. Click save, go back to my browser, hit refresh. There we go. So now I have a blue heading 1, a red heading 2, and a orange heading 3. And we did this with an element selector on our H1. We did this with a class selector, searching for the class called subtitle. And we did this with an ID selector called section title. So these are different ways in a CSS style sheet to search for elements in your HTML pages. And there you go. That's 3 main ways for searching for elements and applying style properties to them. The CSS1 is my template folder, so I'm going to go ahead and copy it. Press Control V. I'm going to rename it to lesson 3 here. Great. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to open up my CSS style. So I'm going to right click on styles.css, choose edit with Notepad++. All right, so let's go ahead and also open up the HTML file. Edit with Notepad++. There we go. So I have both files open. I have the index.html and styles.css. So you should have both files open, index.html and styles.css. In my case, I have H1 Shane, and I already have a color property on it that I used in a previous lesson. So we have used the color property, but we haven't gone in depth over how it works. So let's check it out. So I have an H1 tag around Shane. I can use H1, I can use div, I can use various tags to put around Shane. And I've got a element, or rather type selector, CSS selector, that's trying to find all the H1s. So in my case, I have one H1 around Shane. All right, so that H1 selector will find the word Shane, and here is the color CSS property. So color is mainly used for coloring your text, coloring your fonts. So in this case, it's set to blue. Let's go ahead and take a look at that since it's already set. If you haven't already done this, go ahead and if you need to, stop the video and catch up with me. Add an H1 tag, put some text in the middle of it. Be sure to save it. Go over to your style CSS, type in H1 squiggly bracket, and then the property color, colon, and then whatever color you want, semicolon, and squiggly bracket. So once you have all that, click save, and then let's view it together. Feel free to stop the video if you need to do that. Okay, so I'm gonna assume you caught up there. I'm going to go ahead and open that file up and be sure you did catch up. It's important, in my opinion, that you actually type the code. You don't just listen, but you actually do it. You type the code, and that way it sticks with you longer. So I want to make sure that you actually program and not just listen to someone program. The more you do it, the more you will remember it. Okay, so I'm going to right click on index.html, and I'm going to choose open with Chrome browser. All right, so I have the name Shane, and it is indeed blue. And of course, if I go back to Notepad++, I can change that color. Let's try orange. Let's try orange in lowercase. So I have color, colon, orange, semicolon, click save, go back to my browser. I'm going to click refresh, and there we go. Now it's orange. So that's pretty simple, right? So that's one way of setting the color. There are a lot of colors out there that are supported. Let's check that out. So I'm going to type in HTML colorcodes.com. And this website will let you get an idea of exactly what type of colors are out there. You can click around and you can actually see their hex number here, hexadecimal. You can see the RGB number here. And of course, you've already seen you can use color names. Let's try out this light coral. So I'm gonna copy that. So pound F08080. I'm gonna go back to my editor. I'm gonna erase the orange and I'm gonna cut and paste that number. So type in pound F08080. Click save. Go back to my browser. I'm going to click refresh and the color should change from orange to light coral. So it's changed to light coral. There you go. We use the hexadecimal number to change the color. A lot of your colors, it will be easier to find the hexadecimal number for them than finding the name. Like for example, if I scroll through here, I can pick a color. You can see the hex number up here, RGB value up here. And then there's this large chart here, and you can go up and down the whole chart of colors and choose which shade you want. It's very, you have many choices to choose from. So I'm going to go down. Let's see, what color can we choose? How about this color right here? So this is the hex number for it. So we've seen how to color with the name. This is the hex number for this color. We've seen how to do that. Let's use the RGB numbers for it. All right, so and they are 134, 79, and 145. Back over here. I'm going to erase the hexacode, hex number, type in RGB, parentheses, in parentheses. And that should probably be lowercase. I already forgot the number. Go back there and get that number again. 134, 79, 145. 134, 79, 145. And all right, I'm gonna click save. Go back to my browser, click refresh, and the color changed. What do you know? There you go. So that's an RGB number specifying this color. So we've identified 3 different ways you can change the color so far. I say there's 3, but there's really 2 more ways that you can actually change the color. So let's go over these first 3. First one was, well, the name of the color. That's quite simple. There's a lot of colors out there with different shades, so you don't always have a name to go by. So you can use the hexadecimal number. The hexadecimal number is the pound and then the number following that. And sometimes you'll have the letters A through F. I won't go into what a hexadecimal number is in this lesson, but in the future, hey, we may cover that. So anyway, the hexadecimal number, there's really 3 numbers in there. One, it's for red, green, blue, to specify the different shades of those colors, so they're mixed together. And then you have the RGBA, which does the same thing. You just have different codes. It's not hexadecimal numbers, but it does the red, green, and blue mixture. After that, you have another one that's called HSL. If you go here to the HTML color codes page, you'll see the HSL listed there. HSL basically defines the base color, the hue, and then it defines the saturation, hence the S, and then it defines the lightness, how light something is, how dark something is. So again, the same thing. You can go to color codes and you can choose a color. So if I go here, let's see, I chose this color, so I'm going to do HSL. So that's the base hue, that's the saturation, and that is the lightness value. Let's try that out. I'm going to cut and paste that. There we go. Go back here, HSL. Let's paste that number, 11, 80%, 60%. So 11 is the base color, saturation's at 80%, and the lightness is at 60%. Click Save, go back to my browser. Let's go ahead and click Refresh, and there you go, it changed colors. Let's go back to the lightness, and what happens if I put it 10%, 19%? Click Refresh, and actually got darker. Let's change it to 99%. Click Save, and click Refresh. Whoa, did it get light? Very light. So the higher the number, the lighter it gets. Let's go back. Change that back to, let's say, 50. Click Save. Click Refresh. Oop, wrong window. Click Refresh. It's a little bit darker again now. All right, let's change the saturation. I'm going to go down to 50. Click Save. Go over here. Click Refresh, and you'll see that the saturation actually almost is getting darker and darker. It's actually changing. It's actually changing the mixture of the colors, I believe. So that's HSL. There's also an RGBA instead of just RGB. The RGBA allows you to specify, I believe, the lightness also. Let's try it out real quick. Go back to here, type in RGBA. Let's go choose a color. I'm going to take that one and cut and paste it. Save it. Go here. Okay. I'm going to type in a decimal, 0.5. Click Save. Back to my page. Click Refresh. Change the color. Let's see what that other number does. Let's change it. Go back here. Change it to a 2. Go back. Click Refresh, and it lightened it up. So it's another way of changing the lightness. Go back here. Change it to 9. Click Save. Refresh. Made it darker. There you go. So pretty much like the HSL, the RGBA allows you to change the lightness. So pretty neat. That's it. That's the different ways to change your color CSS property. You have the name, the RGB, the hexadecimal number, the RGBA way, and the HSL way. And we're going to cover the HTML CSS box model. So the box model is very important. It's basically a model that wraps every element in HTML. So it's definitely something you have to know. So hey, let's get started. So on my desktop, I have my index.html file open. I have my style CSS file open. I definitely recommend that you try to program as I program. If you need to stop the video, go ahead and stop the video. If you can't, then hey, we'll have these files ready to download within a week or two of publishing this video on our website, thecodingzoo.com. You can download the files from there and check it out. I went ahead and put together a couple of pages here just to demonstrate the HTML CSS block model. I put together a picture that should kind of give you an idea what that block model is using this index and style sheet. Let's go over to that page. Let's refresh, make sure it's up to date. This picture is meant to show you the layers of that block model. Picture this content in the middle here, this square being a paragraph. It's a few sentences wrapped in a paragraph element. Well, that paragraph element belongs to the block model. That paragraph element would wrap your content. Picture this middle square being your content. Well, on the outside of that content, you'll find there is some space. That space is called padding, and you can manipulate that padding to make other items be further away from your paragraph. That padding fits inside another layer, which is your border. So your border is hidden. You can show it by using styles, and I'll show you how to do that in a few minutes. That border can be manipulated to be a dotted line, a solid line. You can change the style to whatever you like, but just know that there is a padding, which is spacing around your content. There is a border, and around that border is some more space. Well, that space is called margin. And again, that space can be manipulated to be smaller or larger depending on your needs. Your block elements wrap content. They have padding on the outside of that content. That's before the border. So the border wraps around that entire block element. And on the outside of that border is more space called margin. So those are the things you need to remember. You have padding on the inside. You have a border that wraps everything, and you have a margin on the outside, and you can manipulate all of them. Let's jump in. I want to show you an example of doing just that. I'm going to go back to my Notepad++ over here. So hey, let's real quick. Let's add an element with some contents. I'm going to add a div here, and this div, it could be a paragraph, it could be anything. I'm going to add a div. All right, so I'm going to close my div. I have a sentence here. It's wrapped in a div element. Let's go ahead and click save, click refresh, and there we go. So this is the Coding Zoo video series, and more information can be found at thecodingzoo.com. So this paragraph is wrapped in a div element. That div element has this model around it. So this is the content inside of that div. There should be padding on the outside of this, but if you look at it, well, there's not much space there. So I think the padding is probably set to 0. There's no border and there's no margin, so you can't really see the border. And again, there's no space here, so there's probably no margin either. Let's go ahead and fix that, and we can show you how to change all of these items. Jump over to CSS here. Let's go back and give this div an ID. All right, so I gave the div an ID. We're going to access it with a name selector, ID selector. I called it main. Okay, I want to first add a border so we can see that div. All right, so you'll notice now it has a block around it. This is my border. I just activated it. If you look at this model up here, see how this block here, that is meant to signify your border. So between your border and the actual content, there should be some padding. There's not. It must be set to 0. Let's go ahead and change that. All right, so I added padding 10 pixels. Refresh. There we go. So now I have the content, which is signified here. Here's the content. There's padding around it, so you see the space around the content, and there's a border around it. So you see the line going around. That's your border. Keep in mind, I can make that border as large as I want to. Of course, there's usually no need to. So you'll notice the border here. I've got padding between my content and the border, but my border here is right up on this other picture up here. It's right up next to this other border. I don't have a margin. The margin, again, must be defaulted to 0 with this div. So let's go ahead and fix that. And what we should see is this whole block element should be separated from this picture up here. All right, so I'm add a margin. Click save, click refresh, and that should push away from the other element. There we go. So I added 15 pixels on each side. So you'll notice as I set a pixel size for margin, for padding, that it did it all the way around the block element. So there's 15 pixels on each side. So I have a margin here of 15 pixels. I have a border that's 1 pixel wide. and I have padding on the inside, and then in the middle is my content. That's it. This is the HTML CSS block model. It's very important to understand how to manipulate this model so you can move things around, space them correctly, make your web page look good. So you definitely want to learn this model. You want to learn the difference in padding and margin. Sometimes I used to get them mixed up. I used to reverse them. We're going to cover padding in the CSS HTML box model. We're going to show you how to manipulate the padding, different ways of doing so. Top here I have an index file, and inside I also have a CSS file. Let's open that up. And I went ahead and added a picture of that block model. We're going to create some content. We're going to put that content in a div, and then I'm going to show you how to manipulate the padding. So the padding is the space between the content and the border of that block element. Let's try that out. I'm going to go here, I'm going to add div, and I guess I might ought to move to my index HTML file for that div and not put it into my style sheet. That might work better that way. Okay, so I'm going to add a div. I'm going to call this div, let's call it main. I'm going to close the div. Let's put some content inside of there. Okay, so I have a div and it has a sentence inside of it. I'm going to click save, go here, click refresh, and there we go. So here's my content. That content is inside of a div. I didn't put a border around it, so you can't really see the div. But you'll notice there's no space around this sentence. So that can be added two ways. We can add space in the margin, or we can add space in the padding. Today's lesson, I'm going to show you how to add space in that padding. And there's several ways you can do this. So let's go over the first. I'm going to go to my CSS now, and I'm going to add a name or ID selector for main, so I can find that main div. I'm going to put a border just so we can see the div. And I'm going to add padding. I'm going to add 10 pixels. Now you can specify pixels or points. You can specify different types of measurements here. I usually use pixels. So padding, and I forgot my colon. That's kind of a bug already. All right, so save. So I added a border, and I added space between the content and that border. So it puts 10 pixels on each side, top, bottom, and left and right. Because this div extends the entire page, it puts a little bit more space here. That's one way to change it. You can specify one value, and that value will be applied to all sides, top, bottom, left, and right. What if I wanted to change the padding to be different on each side? How would I do that? Well, that's another way you can change padding. So let's jump over to that. So I'm going to say padding dash top, and I'm going to put 5 pixels. So you can specify each side or top or bottom. So I'm going to do padding dash bottom 10 pixels. I'm going to do padding slash dash left 20 pixels, and do padding dash right 50 pixels. So I just set a different padding on each side of that content, and I've got a bug. Fix that. Click save. Okay. So 20 over here, 5, 10, and then 50 over here. Let's change this left side. All right, let's change that to 100. Click refresh, boom. So you notice how the space grew, right? So you can specify one value, or you can specify each side's value by itself. These are two different ways of adding padding. I'm going to show you one more. All right. Okay, so I'm going to go here. I'm going to delete those padding settings. I'm going to add padding back. Now, instead of specifying just 10 pixels for all the way around 10 pixels, I'm going to specify each side right here on this one line. So I'm going to do 25 pixel, 50 pixel, let's do 75 pixel, and 100 pixel. Okay, going to click save. So you might be wondering, which is for which side, which is top, which is bottom, which is left, which is right. So this first item is the top. The second item is your right side. So it's going top, right, and then bottom. So it's going clockwise. So top, right, and then the bottom is 75 here, and then the left is 100. So just think of a clock. Top, right, bottom, left. And I always forget this. Now I know I have to remember that. Clock. Yeah, that makes sense. I always forget. All right, so that's saved. Click refresh, and there we go. So top, then the right gets a little bigger, and then more here and more here. So that's it. There you go. So that's a third way of manipulating padding. You can do something like this. So when you specify 3 values and not 4, or 2 instead of 4, it works like this. So the first one will always be the top. So the 25 pixels here is going to be the top padding, and then the 50 pixels is going to be your right and your left, and then the 75 is going to be your bottom. So this is top, this is right and left, and this is bottom. So I'm going to increase the right and left. I'm going to change these values a little bit. I'm going to do 5 on the top. I'm going to do 100 right and left, and I'm going to do 15 on the bottom. Click save, click refresh. There we go. So my top is very small, my bottom is a little bit bigger, and my right and left are the same. So pretty simple. Now what if I were to change it to 2 items? Well, in this case, the first one is going to be top and bottom, and this one's going to be left and right. Click refresh. There we go. Notice how the bottom shrunk. So that's it. It's pretty simple, pretty easy to manipulate. I showed you 3 different ways of doing it. Really, it's just 2. You can specify padding and put the items all on one level, one line rather. You can specify 1, 2, 3, 4, any of those 4 sides. Using 4 different numbers, or you can use 3 or 2 numbers, or 1 number. So that's one way of doing it. Or you can specify padding dash top, padding dash right, padding dash bottom, padding dash left to specify your value. Pretty easy to manipulate it. I hope that makes sense. I always forget with the one padding line what it represents. What's the first one, what's the second one, what's the third and fourth number. I always forget that. So just remember clockwise. If all 4 numbers are there, clockwise. So you have top, you have right, bottom, left. And that's it. In this lesson, we are going to cover how to change the borders in the CSS Box Model. We're going to show you how to change the borders to different styles, colors, width, all that good stuff, show you different ways of doing that. So let's jump right in. On my desktop, I have my index file. I have a style CSS set up. Feel free to stop the video and code this along with me. There is a lot here, so if you don't have time for that, also check out the website. We usually have the code put out there within 1 or 2 weeks of the video publishing, usually a few days, but you know, hey, just in case, definitely within a week or two. I went ahead and prepared the code ahead of time so we could go through it pretty quickly. It's pretty simple stuff. Let's look at it. So I've got on my page, I've got several divs here, and I've given them CSS classes: dotted, dashed, inset, outset, solid, ridge, double, groove, none, hidden, mix, and rounded. So I have some content in these divs, and I'm going to show you each one of these classes basically puts a different border around this content. So if we go here and click this tab here, you'll see that I've already got the page displaying, and here are the different borders. Here's a dotted border, and it's around that div. Here's a dashed border. Here's an inset border, an outset border, kind of opposite of inset. Here's a solid border. Now notice I have different pixel sizes. You can make the borders, you can make different pixel sizes. Here's a ridge border and a double border, a grooved border. Here's one that has no border, and here's one that has hidden border. So what's the difference in no and hidden? Well, that's a good question. I think it has a lot to do with inheritance of other border properties from parents. I think the hidden will override everything and hide everything, whereas the no border may not. I get it mixed up. I have to check into that and do a video on it. Yeah, I checked that out. So this is a mixed border. So in this border, we have a dotted one. We have a double border, and we have a solid border. So, and here's a dash border on the right. So in this particular border, we mixed all of them together. I'm not quite sure why anybody would want to mix 4 different ones like that. Hey, but yeah, you never know. You know, some people have crazy taste. Okay. All right. So the next one, we have a border that is 3 pixels wide. And I went ahead and showed you could change the color of it. And hey, you can also round the corners off, which is pretty cool. That's very cool. So let's look at the code, the CSS that made each of these. Again, very simple stuff. So if you go up here, here's the dash one. I just do border style : dashed. And again, inset. I set it to inset, outset to outset, so forth. Dotted, double, groove, ridge, non, hidden. And here's the one that has the 4 sides: dotted, dashed, solid, and double. Now I bet you could probably just get rid of 2 of those. And just like with our other properties where you can specify 1, 2, 3, 4 values, the things that affect, you know, the top, bottom, right, left of the box model, I bet you this would do the same. Let's click save, click refresh, and see if it changes that up. Yeah, there we go. So I just used 2 values, the dotted and the dashed. So that's one thing to remember, is most of these properties allow you to specify those multiple values. If there's 4 total values, you could probably specify 3, 2, 1, etc. So just something to be aware of. All right, here's a solid one. So I just got it set to solid. So this is setting the border style, right? So here's the rounded one. I went ahead and set the width 3 pixels. I set the color to red. I set the style to solid. And here's the border radius, 80 pixels. So this is what makes the border kind of rounded on the corners. And you can change that 80 pixels to whatever number you like and just play with it, kind of get the look and feel that you want. Hey, let's do that. That'll be fun. Let's try that out real quick. So I like playing with the radius. Let's add a new div. Oh, check it out. I already got one for us. There we go. So I set this one up so we can play around with the radius. I also wanted to show you how to do all these things in shorthand. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. So I have this text here. It's got a class of round shorthand. I'm going to copy it. And if you look here, there is no style around it. You can't see the border. There's no color. It's not blue. Let's change it. Let's add the CSS. So I'm going to add a new CSS div, and then I'm going to cut and paste that class name. Okay. Now I'm going to do a shorthand. So I'm going to do border. And instead of border width, I'm doing border. I'm going to set the 1 pixel. Let's do 2 pixels. And instead of border style property, I'm going to do the style inline here. So I'm going to do solid. And instead of the border color property by itself, I'm going to go ahead and put it here on the same line too. Let's put blue. So this is kind of a shorthand of setting those border properties. I'm going to skip down and I'm going to go ahead and set the radius on another line. So radius. Now, instead of doing just 80, I'm going to do 80 and 20. So we got 4 corners. Remember how I said you could probably, I'm sure there's at least four properties you can put here shorthand. I'm going to specify 2, which should put 2 corners at 80 and 2 corners at 20 radius. So let's try that out. Look, refresh. There we go. So one of the corners is 80 and one of them is a 20 radius. So it gives it a nice different look and feel there. So you could create a section in your document that has a border, and you, instead of putting the rounded corners, you could put different types of rounded corners, kind of mix it up a little bit. Pretty neat. Notice how the text is kind of scrunched up there. Let's just clean that up real quick. So I'm just going to add a little padding. Hey, why not add a little background color? I'm going to copy this color from here. I'm not sure that'll go well with the solid blue, but hey, let's try it out. Click refresh. So I added padding and color. There we go. So I've got my blue border. I've got the different radiuses in the corners. I've got padding around my text in a different color. So it kind of gives you an idea how you can create sections in your document and style them a little bit differently. I hate that blue with that color. It's killing me. It's driving me nuts. I think I have to change it. My OCD's kicking in. Let's do this. Let's do black. There we go. Let's try that. What's that look like? Not too bad. Better, but it's also so thick. It's driving me nuts. Too thick. Okay, now I'm getting picky here. All right. Refresh. There we go. I like that much better. Anyway, so there you go. You have all kinds of borders. You have different styles. You can have different colors. You can set different widths. And you can even set the radius of the corners. Pretty neat stuff. Very powerful, but simple. I love using. In this lesson, we are going to cover how to manipulate the margin in the CSS HTML box model. All right, so hey, on my desktop here, I have my index file, my styles sheet. I went ahead and grabbed the files that have the template of the HTML CSS box model. In previous lessons, we learned about the padding and the border, and in this lesson, we're going to learn about margin. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go to this page, click refresh, make sure I got the most up to date. Here's the box model. So as a reminder, it has content. That content has padding around it, which is the space around it. And then after that padding, there is a border, and that border can be as wide as you want. We've covered padding and border in previous lessons. This lesson, we're going to cover this margin. So the margin is the space that's on the outside of your border. The padding is the space between your border and your content. Margin is the space between your border and other elements on the page. Let's go ahead and check that out. All right, so I'm going to go down to the bottom here, add a new div. Let's call it main. Okay, I'm going to add a paragraph. Okay, I'm going to go to my CSS here, and I'm going to add a ID or name selector for main. And I'm going to put a border around that div just so we can see it. All right, click save, click refresh. There we go. So here's this div. Here's my content, and there is no space between the content and the border. I haven't added any padding. We're not going to worry about that this lesson. Check out the previous lessons for that. I'm going to, if you notice the border here, it's right up against this other elements border. It's right up against this box model diagram here. It's right up against there. So there's no space there. It's also very close to the edge here too. So there's not much space there. So, and if I had something after this item here, you would see it's also very close. Let me do that real quick. All right, click save. I'm going to put a border around it also. Cut and paste, save some time. All right, click refresh. There you go. So you notice they're all scrunched up together there. So let's go ahead and manipulate that. Let's change the margin. So I'm going to go to here, and I'm going to set a margin of 20 pixels. Now you can use different measurements, pixels or points, cm, etc. I'm using pixels. Click refresh. There we go. So you'll notice my border stayed tight against the content because I didn't change the padding, but I did change the margin, which changed the margin on each side of the element. Right? So I added some on the top, left, right, and bottom. So pretty simple. Notice how the element after that got pushed down and there's space between it. Pretty simple. Now watch this. You can actually, this is one way to change it. This put 20 pixels on each side. So what if you wanted a different amount of pixels on left and right versus top and bottom? Well, one way to do that is to specify this. I'm going to say 20 pixels and 10 pixels, right? So 20 and 10. This should be 20 pixels on top and bottom, and then 20 pixels on left and right. Well, I won't use 20. Let's use something a little smaller. It'd be hard to tell if it's working if I use 20 and 20. All right, here we go. Click save. All right, click refresh. Now we should see it jump to the left. There it goes. So it jumped to the left, and it still kept 20 from the top and 20 from the bottom. Let's make sure that's working correctly. Let's add 50. Let's make it 50. There we go. Click refresh. There we go. It's just got a small margin here, and 50 on top, 50 on bottom. What if I specified 3 values? How about 25? Well, how do you know which value goes to which side when you specify 3 or 4? If you specify 2, the first one is top and bottom. The second one is left and right. If you specify 3, well, there's 4 sides, so which 3, right? So I'm going to click refresh. All right. So on the top, I have the 50. So here's my 50 right here. Now so top is 50. Now on the right, it's 5. And on the bottom is 25. So the way you tell is the first one is top. It's clockwise. The next one is your right. The next one is your bottom. And the next one is your left. So I'm going to go ahead, instead of doing 3, I'm going to go ahead and add 4. Let's add 100. So that should push it way out. Click save. Click refresh. There we go. Pushed it way out. So that's one way of specifying different width of margin on the different sides. So pretty cool. There's also another way of doing this. I could say erase this one, and let's just do margin top. Say 10 pixels. Let's do margin bottom. Do 20 pixels. Margin left. Let's do 5 pixels and margin right. Let's do 150 pixels. So this is another way of setting those 4 values instead of doing it on one line. Or if you ever just need to set one, you can do it this way. So click Save and click Refresh. There we go. So on the left, I have 5 pixels. On the right, I have 150. On the bottom, you see it's greater than the top. So on the bottom, what I put? Bottom, I have 20. Top, I had 10. So that would explain why it's more on the bottom than the top. So there you have it. It's very simple to use, very easy to do. You can specify the margin both ways. You can put it all on one line using the property margin, and you can specify to 3 or 4 values, or you specify 1 value, 2, 3, 4, however you want to do it. Or you can specify each margin this way. So pretty simple. All right, so that's one way of adding space around your element to push it away from other elements. I've got this index.html page already created for us. It's got my doc type, it's got my HTML tag, my header, my body. I've got a header, and I've got a main section, and I've got a couple of articles here. I went ahead and prepared this for us so we can go ahead and get through the lesson a little bit quicker. We're going to be using CSS to format different items on this page. You do that by including a style sheet and using CSS selectors and providing properties for those selectors. So if you look here at the top, if you're not familiar, I'm including a style sheet right here. That style sheet is this file right here, and I've already added a few basic selectors. So here is a selector that basically is an element or type selector, and I'm selecting the HTML element and the body element, and I'm setting the margin and padding. Here's another one here where I'm selecting the main and the article element. Again, it's a multiple element selector. It's basically a type selector, and I'm setting the margin to 10 pixels. And here's where I'm selecting a single type, the header element, and I'm setting the background color to blue. So I went ahead and set this up with basic selectors. If you're not familiar with these basic selectors here, that and including the name selector, ID selector, or the class selector, check out one of my previous lessons. It's in the CSS building blocks. We cover that. I'll put a link below to that video. All right, so I have my basic index page. I got my basic styles.css page. Let's go ahead and check out what this page looks like at the very beginning. Here's my main header at the top here. I have this unordered list at the top here. Think of it as like a menu. It's got main, page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, or rather main, page 2, page 3, page 4. I've got a title. I've got one section here. It's got my favorite authors. I've got another unordered list. And here are a couple of different paragraphs. And here is another article with a title and another unordered list. I'm going to show you how we can manipulate some of these elements and change them up. So, all right, so let's go ahead and start with the menu. Here's the menu list right here. Here's my navigation element, and here's the unordered list that would make up that navigation, that menu. If you go back and look at it, it looks kind of weird. It's just a regular list here. It doesn't look like your common menu. Let's go ahead and fix that up. So in order to do that, I can select these elements different ways. I'm going to show you a couple of different ways of doing that. So the first example I'm going to give you is basically a child selector. A child selector is a way to select the children of a given element, and it would be the immediate children, be the children that are right underneath it. Give you an example. I'm going to build a selector that would select the UL tag under nav, and it would select the child element LI under UL. UL is a child of nav, and LI is a child of UL. So let's write that up real quick. Okay, so I'm going to do nav to select that type nav, and I'm going to select a nav that I'm going to select that unordered list underneath that nav. So this greater than sign is a way to say I want to do a child selector. I'm going to select a child that's immediately beneath whatever element you're specifying, whatever type you're specifying. So I'm going to select the li tag underneath that, put my two brackets, and now I'm going to add a little style to those tags. I want to put a padding of 3 pixels. I'll put a color of white, and let's do a width 100 pixels. How about a margin of 0 pixels? And let's do display, let's do inline block. Okay, and let's change the background color. How about blue? All right, press Control S to save. So I've done a child selector. I'm selecting the child of nav, this UL child of nav, and I'm selecting the li child, or line item child of this unordered list. I saved it. Let's go over here and click refresh. This is what I'm trying to select. Refresh. There we go. So I was able to select those line items and style them to white, and I made them inline blocks so they now are side by side. So that's one way of selecting those particular elements. That's called, again, a child selector. I'm basically selecting the immediate child of something. Another way of doing that same thing is to have a descendants selector. It's a little bit shorter hand than what I just did. Let's go ahead and change that child selector to a descendants selector. So keep in mind a child selector, you're specifying a whole path down to a given element. So that will help you narrow down to exactly what you want. So what if there were multiple navs on this page and it had multiple childs, right? Well, you would pick the nav. This would allow you to specify the nav that has the unordered list, that has the line item. It gives you kind of an exact path to what you're trying to do. And of course, in some cases, you would just use a class selector or an ID selector and do these things. But sometimes you have to actually do it this way and use a child selector. There's different use cases, right? Different use cases require different ways of doing this. I'm going to change this to a descendants selector. So that was a child selector. Let's comment this out. So we keep the code on thecodingzoo.com for you to download and study, play around with. And I'm going to create a descendants selector. I'm going to cut and paste some of this. All right, so I want to choose nav again, and instead of selecting 2 child levels down, I'm just going to say I want you to select all the line item descendants underneath nav. So this is a descendant selector. I can skip a level. I'm looking for all of the li items under nav, and it doesn't matter if there are multiple unordered list or ordered list. It's going to find all the line items no matter how deep they are. That's the difference in descendant selector and child selector. So if I have a child, I have a child, her name's Jai or Gabrielle. She's sitting right over here at the Coding Zoo. I'm selecting my daughter here. But she's also a descendant. But you know, I could be a grandparent. That grandparent and the grandchild, that grandchild is not my child. She's a descendant, right? So descendants is kind of further down. It allows you to select all the way down this tree, this family tree of elements, right? So that's the difference in descendants and child selectors. So I'm going to save this, and I should be able to click refresh and see that it looks the same. I'm going to change it to red just so we can see the difference. I'll probably change it back. Yeah, see how it changed it to red. All right, so let's change that back. So that's a better way than the child selector in this case. In some cases, you might need to use a child selector for whatever reason. This is a descendants selector. Pretty simple, pretty easy. I just specify the first element, and then I specify whatever element I'm looking for that's inside of that first element. With the child selector, I use a greater than sign. That means the immediate child, not the descendants. All right, let's move on. All right, so I didn't really like the way this padding looked here at the top. Let's real quickly, or rather margin, let's really quickly add another descendants selector. So I'm going to select the unordered list underneath nav, and I'm going to add a margin of 0 pixels, save it, refresh, and made that bounce to the top there. All right, let's cover another one. It's called a pseudo class selector. A pseudo class selector is basically a keyword that's added to a selector that specifies a special state of the selected element. So I'm doing an element selector, and I'm adding this keyword that specifies a particular state that selector might be in. For example, if you're hovering over something, that element is in a hover state. If you clicked on something, then the element is in an active state. There's different types of pseudo classes. Let's go ahead and try that out. So I want to basically change the style of this menu when I hover over it. So I'm going to use a pseudo class selector. So I'm going to do nav, select the element nav, and I want to select the child descendant line items of nav, and I want to say that when they are hovered, that their style, when they're in the hover state, their style will be changed to, let's do a different background color, and let's do orchid, and let's make the text a different color too. So let's do black. So this is a pseudo class selector. It's using a element descendants selector, and it's adding the pseudo class of hover. I'm going to save it, click refresh, and refreshed it. You don't see a difference, but as you hover over it, you'll notice that the text turns black and it turns into this orchid color for the background. You can hover over each of these. So when I hover over it, this element goes into a state that's called hover, and a new style is applied. That is a pseudo class selector. Pretty neat stuff. Okay, I want to show you how to combine an element descendant selector with an ID selector. So I want to choose, let's go ahead over here. I want to choose the main element and the paragraphs in the main element, but I don't want all the paragraphs. I want the paragraphs that have an ID. Pound is for a name or ID selector. ID of intro, so INTRO. And I want to put a different style on that. So I'm going to put a font style of italic. All right, so I'm saying find me the main element type. I'm saying find me the paragraphs underneath there, but only the one that has an ID of intro. So I'm combining these different combination of selectors. I'm going to save that. If you look over here, I have a main, and there's a paragraph, and there's the keyword intro. Let's click refresh. There we go. So it turned it italics. I was able to find that exact one. Now if I go back over to here and add another paragraph and put some lorem ipsum type test in there, you'll notice it will not turn that into italics. It's plain font style. It's a plain font style. All right, so that is a neat combination. Just wanted to show you can do different combinations of these different types of selectors. I provided an element or type selector. It actually chose descendant, and it used an ID selector as part of it also. Let's move on to the next one. So I want to show you, you can actually go down to the attribute level. You can go down and choose something based upon what attribute value it has. So here's basically an attribute selector. So I'm going to select the LI element, and I want to style the one that has an attribute title that is equal to the word easiest. So I'm going to color it red. So I'm selecting the LI tag, but only the one that has a title attribute that equals easiest. So save that, go back to here. You'll see that right down here that has the title attribute and it has the value of easiest. And I'm going to put title here also equals just so you'll know that it's selecting them on multiple ones that have titles, but only one has that particular text we're looking for. Let's save that, click refresh, and there we go. It only colored the JavaScript the color we told it to color. So that's selecting based upon an attribute's value of a given element. Let's move to the next one. That one's pretty neat. So there's just different ways. It gets really complicated, but it's very easy to use once you understand the syntax. But I'm just trying to say you can use very complicated search type combinations here. Let's go back to styles. Now this one's going to be a little bit different. I want to do what's called a sibling selector. So this is going to be what's called an adjacent sibling selector. It's going to select the sibling to an item. A sibling is basically, think brother or sister, right? So it's the one that's right next to it. It's not below it. It's not a child, but it's like right next to it. So this li tag here, it has a sibling. Its sibling is this li tag right here, and this li tag right here. Now this ul tag, its sibling would not be the li tag. The li tag would be a child. The ul tag would have a sibling of h2, right? That would be its sibling. So you kind of get the gist. A sibling is the elements at the same level of whatever element you're starting with. I want to find basically this element right here. Now I want to get rid of this title. Let's assume this title isn't there. But let's say I want to color this Python a different color. Well, first I can find this sibling and say, give me the immediate sibling right after that. So that would be this one, Python. Now, since it's going to be an adjacent sibling selector, it won't color this Java one because I'm going to use an adjacent sibling selector that will color the one that's immediately next to that element, the sibling that's right next to it. Let's type that in and see how that works. So, all right, so I'm going to find the one that has the title. Here, let's cut and paste, save a little time there. Okay, so I'm finding that element. I'm going to do plus. Plus is the adjacent sibling selector syntax. So li. So I want to find the sibling that's right next to that li tag that has the title easiest. And I'm going to set the color to blue. Save it. So if we did this correctly, Python should be the only one that turns blue. There we go. So it found the adjacent sibling to the li tag that had the title easiest. So again, that's called an adjacent sibling. The plus sign lets you specify that. All right, so last but not least, let's go ahead and check out a regular sibling selector. Now, a regular sibling selector would find all the siblings at that level of the element that you originally find. So you find an element and it will find all of its siblings and apply a style to that. So I'm gonna comment this one out real quick. We're gonna use that same list. So this is an adjacent sibling using the plus. Let's do a regular sibling selector. And for that, I'm going to use this squiggly line here. I forget what that's called. I call it a squiggly line. I need to look that up one of these days. If you know what that's called, hey, leave us a comment below. Let us know. One of these days, I need to search that up. I call it the squiggly line. Okay, so we use the li tag element type. We use the li element selector. Find the one that has a title attribute that's equal to easiest. And we use the squiggly line, and I'm going to point to the li siblings. That's a sibling to this one that has a title of easiest. And I'm going to apply a style of, let's do a color again. And instead of blue, like we did before, I'm going to turn them both yellow. So if this works correctly, it should find both of these, not just Python. It should find both of these as a sibling and turn them yellow. So click refresh, and there we go. Boy, that's ugly. It's an ugly color. Huh, let's try, let's try purple. Click refresh. So that's a regular sibling selector. We have an adjacent sibling selector that was above it. We used attribute selectors, child selectors, pseudo class selectors. We used child selectors in combination with an ID or name selector. We used descendant selectors. There's so many different ways of using selectors to find a given element and change its properties. So I just wanted to show you what are those different types and how you can put them together. And you can use these combinations, any of these combinations together to find what you're looking for. So those are the different ways you can actually select and find different elements in your document to specify CSS properties. I have a index.html file here. I've got my basic doc type, my HTML element, my head. I've created this little divide, this little div here, and I've added this fake text in the middle, and I've given it an ID of overflow example. So let's take a look at this div. I went ahead and prepared this code for us so we can make this lesson a little bit quicker for you. However, I do recommend that you actually copy the code, play around with it, type the code out so that you can get used to the syntax, and it'll stick more in your head if you actually do it along with me or afterwards instead of just watching. So definitely recommend that you actually get into it and do some coding. That's the quickest way to learn. Okay, hey, so let's check out the styles property. Right now I've got this ID or name selector, overflow example. I'm setting this div to a height of 150 pixels, padding the inside spacing 5 pixels. I've got a black border around it, and then there's this overflow property that we're going to go over in this lesson. So there's different values you can use for overflow. The default value is visible. So by not having an overflow value here, it would be the same as typing in this value, visible. So I'm going to erase that. Let's save everything, and let's see what this page looks like. So I should have it already here in my browser somewhere. There we go. All right, so this is the page. Click refresh. So this is the page. This is the div. It's set to a certain size. Now this page is kind of somewhat responsive, right? So if I do this, you'll notice the div kind of squeezes tighter there, right? What happens to the text? Well, when it's defaulted to visible or set explicitly to visible, the text that's in that div stays visible. It stays on the screen, and it goes outside of your div. It's now outside of that div that text belongs to, that paragraph belongs to. So this paragraph, this text, content belongs to this div, but now it's actually displaying outside of it because of the way I did the browser here, the way I changed it. So what can you do in these cases? How do you make these things, that looks kind of ugly. What would you do to make it look better? Well, it depends on your use case, depends on what you're doing. If this was text, you didn't really mind if it was some kind of content, you didn't mind if you saw all of it or not, if it got smaller, then you could do something like this. You can set the overflow to hidden. Let's try that out. All right, so I'm going to set it to hidden, save it. Go here and click refresh. Now let's move it and see what happens. Now notice how the text starts to hide underneath there. You can't actually see it. It's kind of gone, right? Now, in most cases, that's probably not what you need. It's not suitable. So what are your other options? Well, another option is to specify scroll. So I'm going to specify scroll, and let's go back here. Let's make it wide again. I'm going to click refresh, and you'll notice now that it has scroll bars. Even though the text fits, it has these horizontal and vertical scroll bars. I'm actually pointing at the screen here. You can't see that, can you? Here, let me use the mouse. So it actually has this horizontal and vertical scroll bar, right? And that's even if the text isn't outside of the div. So that's kind of makes it a little ugly a little bit, right? Because you don't always need the scroll bar. Why show it if you don't need it? But when you do need it, like right here, you can go in here and just scroll down and read the text, right? The user can actually read it. Now, if this had a set width, you could actually use this horizontal scroll bar to scroll back and forth also. So that's one way of doing it, but maybe I don't want the scroll bar if it fits, right? So another way of doing this is specify auto. So auto basically tells it, use what you need. If it fits, just make it visible, make it shown, and if you start getting smaller and smaller, then move over to scroll mode. So let's go back to it. Let's click refresh, and you'll notice the scroll bars went away. If I move it a little bit, there we go. The scroll bar came back. Now you'll notice it only gave me this vertical scroll bar because I only need to scroll up and down. If this had like a set width, it would give me the horizontal scroll bar also in the auto mode. It gives you what you need. It's automatic, basically. So there are your main values that you can use with the overflow. There's visible, that's the default. There's auto, it gives you what you need. That's probably the most used. And there's hidden, which basically just hides the text. The content doesn't matter if the user sees it all. I rarely use that one. And then there's scroll, which puts a scroll bar no matter what. The scroll bar is always there. So now what if I wanted to specifically say, hey, I just want a scroll bar horizontal. I don't want to decide for me. I know what I want. I want to have a particular scroll bar that's not horizontal, but vertical, let's say. So another way of specifying overflow is basically overflow dash X, which is horizontal, and Y for vertical. So I'm going to do overflow Y. I'm going to put a scroll. Better put an R there because I'm pretty sure there's no such thing as a skull. So scroll, save it, go over here, click refresh. And I basically just said, hey, for the vertical, I definitely want a scroll bar. Go ahead and put it on there. And of course, I could do the same for horizontal. Save that. And now I have one horizontal. And of course, you could specify both. So one horizontal and one vertical. So you have the overflow property. It has the different values of scroll, hidden, auto, invisible, and you have the overflow X and overflow Y properties. And that's pretty much it. That is your overflow CSS property. You definitely need to get used to using it and when to use it, because as you move things around and situate things on your page and you make them work with different size monitors and with your phone, you want to specify those things. You want to specify how the content acts at a certain width, a certain height, all that good stuff. So this is probably one of the first things you should definitely get used to, of learning when and how to use this. On my desktop here, I've got an index.html page. I went ahead and set up a couple of divs here. We're going to use the divs to demonstrate height and width. Now, keep in mind the height and width properties pretty much can be used on most HTML elements. We're going to use them on a couple of divs and put a border around those divs so it'll be easy to show you how things are working. So I've got a div here. It's called example-width, and I've got another div here. It's called example.height. Let's go ahead and let's look at those two. Refresh. Okay. Here's my first paragraph. Just a little bit of text there. Notice how the div, of course, it spans all the way across the page. It's a block element. It's taking up the whole line because we haven't put a width on it yet. And here's the other div, again, taking up the whole line. So let's go back and let's manipulate the width and the height of these two divs. All right, so I'm going to go into a CSS file that I have attached, style.css. Here's our example width ID selector. I'm going to add a width property to this div. So width, and let's do a width of, let's say, 600 pixels. I'm going to choose to save it. Go over here, click refresh. There we go. Now the div is 600 pixels. You can see that it only went so far out and the text went to the next line. We were able to specify a width and make sure it didn't go past that width. Let's try a different value there. I'm going to change it to, let's do 800. See how that looks. All right, so we can see that the div is now 800 pixels. It went to a width of 800 pixels. Now, what happens if I move this browser around? I just set a hard width of 800 pixels. Look at there. So the div actually goes off the screen and it's not flexible. Now, let's change it up a little bit. So let's change it up a little bit. Instead of a width of 800 pixels, what if I just set a maximum width? So that's the largest I want it to reach, but it can be smaller. What will happen then? So instead of width, let's use max width. Let's see what happens. Go here, click refresh, and there we go. So the div is actually less than 800 pixels, but when we expand this out, you'll see it will not go greater than 800 pixels. So that's our max width. So you can use width to specify a particular width and make it stay at that width no matter what. Or you can use max width and specify, hey, this is the largest I want it to get. And that way it has the flexibility to get smaller if it needs to. Now there is one other width property I can use. Okay, let's grab this browser again and let's make it smaller. I've still got it, where do I have it? Yep, okay, I still got it on max width. And I'm gonna make it smaller and smaller. Now, what if that is too small? What if I didn't want to allow for it to get this small? How can I fix that? Well, there is a property called min width. So I'm going to set a min width. And let's do 500 pixels. I'm going to click save. Back to my browser, click refresh. And there we go. You'll notice it went off the edge there. So it will not get larger than 800 pixels, but it also will not get smaller than 500 pixels. Yep, let's see. There we go. So see, it only got so small in width. Pretty neat. So you have a width, which sets it to an exact width. You have a max width, which says, hey, it can only grow this far. And you have a min width, which says, hey, it can only get this small. Pretty neat. All right, let's jump over to height. Let's check out the height property. All right, so I'm going to go to this example height ID, a name selector, and I'm going to add a maximum height. Well, first, let's play around with this browser some. Let's see how far this will grow. There we go. So it grew this far. I'm going to add a little bit more text in there so you can see, get a better idea of what I'm talking about. So I want to put a little bit more in there, save it, go back, refresh. So it grew a pretty good bit, right? Maybe we don't want to get that tall. Let's go ahead and change it up. I'm going to add, well, we added width a few minutes ago. I'm going to add height. I'm going to add height to this name selector for that div, example height. So I'm going to do height, and I'm going to put 300 pixels, and I'm going to click save, refresh, and there we go. So you'll notice the height is now tied to 300 pixels. I can scroll up and down. Now the reason I can scroll up and down is because I set this property overflow. I set it to auto. Now if you're not familiar with overflow, I did a lesson a few weeks back on that. I'll put a link below or at the end of this video to point you to that lesson. Pretty good stuff. You should definitely learn how to use overflow. All right, so let's go back. So if I spread this out here, you'll notice the div is actually too big. Now I'm using up too much space. So instead of making this div automatically be 300 pixels, well, what can I do? Well, I can do the same thing I did with width. I can put the maximum height allowed to be 300 pixels, not the height, but the maximum height. So if I do that and click save, go back, click refresh, and there we go. So now it's only using enough space that it needs for that paragraph. It's not wasting space. If I go back here, you'll still see it will not get larger than or taller than 300 pixels. So that's an example of using max height. Now let's say that it was possible for this text to get very small as far as the height. I'm going to remove some of this text here. Click refresh. Now notice how small this div is now. Perhaps I don't want that div to be too small. I want to be able to grow in height and only reach a certain height, but I don't want to get too small either. So what would I do? Well, same as the width, I'm going to use a min height. So I can go ahead and set a min. And I'm going to do 50 pixels. Click save. Control S and refresh. Now you'll notice that it jumped a little bit there and made it a little bit taller and became a particular size. So this is as small as it'll get, and the 300 pixels is as large as it will get depending upon the data. So for width and height, we have a width, max width, a min width, and we have a height, the max height, and a min height. Maximum height says you can go this far, this tall. You can't go over that, but if you don't need that much space, I'm not going to use it. Min height is, well, don't make it smaller than this tallness. Don't make it smaller than this height. Same for width. Width says be this exact size and width. Min width says don't be smaller than this. Max width is, hey, you can go this far in width, but you don't have to, right? You don't have to use that space and waste it. Those are the height and width properties in CSS. I hope that makes sense. You can use these with divs, images, you name it. You can pretty much use it on most HTML elements. It's very useful. I highly recommend to play around with different type of HTML elements. Try them out, see how you can manipulate those elements. All right, so hey, that's it for today. I hope that makes a lot of sense. If you have any questions, leave us a message below. If you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and click subscribe below and click that bell icon. That helps us out a lot. We really appreciate it. Let others know, if you enjoyed this video, let others know about our YouTube channel. Send them our way. We really appreciate it. If you like the video, also click like. If you dislike, click dislike too. Leave us a message. Let us know how we can improve. Leave us a message. Let us know if you have any questions. We'll definitely get back to you. So that's it for today. I just want to say thank you, and I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Bye.